Hello. Today, episode 76 of my so-called NOTCAST. It's the 4th of April. It's Easter Sunday. It's 2021. And today I'm not going to be talking about records, which is probably going to be a surprise for you. And it's not even going to be me not talking about records that were made in the 80s or the 90s or the noughties or anything. Instead, I'm going to be doing a ranking of a film director that I really, really like, Michael Mann. And this may be quite niche and not necessarily of interest to many of you, but if you're anything like me and you've watched a lot of movies over the years, then you will have opinions about things. And if there's one thing I'm not short on, it is both opinions and time, a disastrous combination which could ultimately be my downfall. Now, for the past year and a bit, we've not been going anywhere, we've not been seeing anyone, there's not been any shows, so we've been stuck inside or outside in the summer, watching movies, watching television, and catching up on all the culture that we otherwise wouldn't necessarily have had an opportunity to see because a band that we like was playing, or there was a pub, or there were actual other human beings to hang out with. And in my time, I've been writing a list, because what else can a man do but write a list? Well, probably fix something in the house with DIY skills. But writing a list is really, really important. I've built a list of everything that I've watched so far this year, and I've got them on a couple of sheets of paper that are over there. Every time I have a film on, every time I have a concert on, every time I listen to a record, I write it down on the list with the date that I watch it. And so far, it's looking pretty hefty. Now, during that, it occurred to me that one of the great loves of my life, one of the things that I haven't necessarily talked about perhaps as much as is deserves on these, is films. I absolutely love movies. I think that movies really, really changed my life when I was younger. They gave me a sense of narrative structure around events in a world and a life that filmed essentially somewhat chaotic. My origin story when I was a teenager didn't necessarily make a huge amount of sense. I got up, I went to school, I had food, I learnt lessons, I came back, and that was it. And it was largely a very featureless, barren existence. And inside that, I kind of gravitated towards watching movies, partially as a way of filling the time, secondly because there was a huge amount of VHS tapes in the house, and thirdly because I really, really enjoyed it. Really, really enjoyed it. And obviously, as I've mentioned previously, my love of music comes from my love of films. And what I've decided to do is actually revisit the works of a number of directors that I absolutely love. So I love Stanley Kubrick, John Carpenter, David Lynch, David Fincher. These are all people whose work I'm revisiting chronologically in order over time, with the idea of being able to talk about their entire body of work. And over time, I'm going to be doing a number of these where I talk about respective directors and films that are important to me. So today, Michael Mann, who is an American film director. I think it's fair to say he makes very manly films, and that sounds a little bit cynical and a little bit cheeky, but I fully stand by the criticisms that have been made of it. It is a film by a man for men around manly things, like the battle between your convictions and your circumstances and your compromises around that. And the female characters in a lot of his movies are pretty poorly drawn, to be honest. And part of that could be that's just not something which he's interested in making films about. Some of the films are quite cold, but overall, all the films have a common thread that runs through them, and it's around people battling their conscience versus their circumstances, really. And so we'll start off. Now, there are two films I can't mention because I haven't seen them, because they're American TV movies that have either not been released in Britain or are very, very difficult to get hold of. So, for example, it's The Jericho Mile, which was made, I think, in about 1979, and LA Takedown, which was made in 1989. Both of those I haven't seen, and it's not for a lack of trying. I think they are available, but they don't hang around for long, and they're normally quite expensive when they do turn up. And some of them have only been released in America, If they were readily available, I would have seen them. So he's made, I think, a number of films. I think it's 11 films in the course of his life. And we're going to go through them, starting with the one that I think is the worst. So some of the films of his that you will have seen, that you might have opinions about: Heat, Insider, The Keep, Last of the Mohicans, Collateral, Ali, Miami Vice. I'm just reading them down from a list of DVDs that I've got down here. But my least favourite film of his, and the one which I would recommend if you want to start with his work, definitely don't start here. It is Black Hat. I dislike Black Hat to the extent that I do not own it on DVD. I think it is a very bad film indeed. It's a 2015 movie that's available in, I think, about 3 different director's cuts. And Black Hat is kind of feels like it's a 20 years too late in its making, because it's around a computer hacker. It's around, I think, stock trading. There's explosions. We watched Keanu Reeves and Morgan Freeman in Chain Reaction from 1996 earlier on today, and there was a whole bunch of movies that came out in the early 90s, and people had started hearing about the internet, things like Hackers and that other one, the one with the movies with Sandra Bullock, The Net, Hackers, The Net, Chain Reaction, Johnny Mnemonic. All those were kind of movies about technology. Strange Days as well, actually. All movies about technology and weird things. Lawnmower Man. How could I have forgotten The Lawnmower Man? Terrible film, and I saw it at the cinema. And by the way, Joe, I'm very, very sorry that we saw it at the cinema. I wish we'd seen something that was, well, frankly, less rubbish. So Black Hat really reminds me of those mid-90s generic techno thrillers, where even though the technology and the worlds that are being described and the terminology is accurate and historically correct, when you're watching it 6 years later, as I did a couple of months ago, it's immediately dated. I'm watching it and going, that doesn't happen. That can't happen. The technology doesn't exist without that happens. So there's lots of dramatic license in the movie, even though I think broadly it's technologically correct. It's also a film that I watched and I was bored. It's a story about a man dealing with his ethics whilst in the midst of trying to escape from his past. It's a film about somebody that's a convicted computer hacker who's now trying to go straight, who suddenly finds himself in a situation where he might have to go back to the skills which got him into prison in the first place. It's a story that Michael Mann has told better and with more skill, more fluidity and more validity in other movies. And so therefore I was bored. I was completely uninvested in what was happening in the film. I think it was a film that was made out of habit as opposed to a film which has got something to say. And as Oscar Wilde once said, there are some people that mistake saying something with having something to say. And it doesn't say anything. It doesn't have a point to exist, apart from the fact that Michael Mann needs to make a movie. Chris Hemsworth wants to make a movie with the guy that directed all those other great movies, and everybody is punching below their weight. The narrative just doesn't feel strong enough to hold up the story that it's trying to tell, and it's just not convincing at all. It's kind of like, although I have no direct experience of this because I will never have listened to either of the albums, it's kind of like Meatloaf going back and doing Bat Out of Hell 2 in 1993, 16 years after the event, and everyone just going, why? Are you doing this because you're bored, or are you doing this because you want money? There's no reason for this to exist. It's not quite as bad as E.T. and the Green Planet, but it's certainly a bad movie. I do not like it at all. And then the other one, which again is another film which I think he's told the story of better and more fluently elsewhere, was 2009's Public Enemies with Johnny Depp. I've got this on DVD, or more correctly, I've had this on DVD and I've given it away to the charity shop. It's a very similar story to films like Heat. It's a story of a bank robber and the police chase to try and catch him down and bring him to justice, about what it's like to be a person who exists in the criminal world when the world around you isn't criminal. It's a story that is been told many times on a couple of times by Michael Mann himself, and in a much better way by Michael Mann himself. I didn't like the film. It really felt like it was a remake of Thief, but everyone was wearing pork pie hats, and it was the 1930s. And I'm afraid to say, Johnny Depp is perhaps not the greatest actor in the world. Around about this time, there becomes a time when people become kind of veering into almost self-parody. That they know that there's a certain kind of characteristic or a certain kind of personality that people expect from an actor, and sometimes those actors lean into that and they become almost like a parody or a pastiche of themselves. Marlon Brando did it. Robert De Niro's done it. It's with everything he made after the Adventures of Rocky and Bullwinkle. Pretty much everything he's made after the Adventures of Rocky and Bullwinkle is a variation on a theme, something he's done before. Johnny Depp's done it. He did it in Public Enemies. He does it in most of his Tim Burton films as well, actually, especially things like Willy Wonka, and there's a couple of other ones he's made. The one about, I can't even remember, but you end up going and watching Johnny Depp as opposed to I'm watching an actor who happens to be Johnny Depp. Jack Nicholson fell into it as well. It's almost like there's a setting, and he sets himself on the setting on the back of his neck, kind of like the 2000 AD character. That's got 4 settings in his psychosis. Jack Nicholson just set himself to setting number 3, and that's how you got through the movie. Johnny Depp is the same thing. I did not like the Public Enemies at all. Now the next one that I'll mention, and I'm not going to give this a huge amount of airtime because it isn't really a movie, is the original Miami Vice TV show. Here is the soundtrack CD, which I think I paid £1 for it from a British Heart Foundation. Michael Mann's hands are all over this as a TV show. Created it. I think he directed some episodes, executive produced it, he chose the pastel colours, he chose the soundtracks. So, at the time he was very clearly kind of furrowing a very narrow brow around cop thrillers. This was the Miami Vice in 1986, was the start of that. He followed it up with a show called Crime Story. He followed it up with a film called LA Takedown. He followed that up with Heat, and he's been obsessed with law enforcement and behaviour around it. So that's the first kind of 3. Now, the of the films which I've got on DVD, probably the one which I dislike the most, I'm ranking this, is 1992's Last of the Mohicans. It's a historical drama, and very few historical dramas really keep my interest for a number of reasons. Being able to watch tales of 1800s and men conquering the outback and all that type of stuff. There's a story to be told in that, and it's a valid story, but it's not a story which I can necessarily relate to. And also, I think, although this is an authentically detailed recreation of a turbulent era in US colonial history and an exciting saga of flintlocks and tomahawks warfare, and where 2 people are caught up as lovers in the tumult of the French and Indian War, it wasn't, for me at least, that good. It follows the same kind of things where it's about a person that's torn between their morals and their obligations, and then them doing the things that they have to do in order to maintain their moral position. But it's a bit of a historical epic, and historical epics can be very dull unless they're done very, very well or very originally, and this isn't done necessarily in original fashion. Now, the original 1936 film of this was hugely formative to Michael Mann as a child, but this is a cover version of that, and it can't be as good as the original. No matter how influential it was to him. It's clearly a passion project to him. Daniel Day-Lewis is an incredible actor. When he does his role, you can easily see him disappearing into a role. He disappears into a role in this, but to me it feels there was a lot of historical epics around about the 80s and the 90s, things like 1492, Conquest of Paradise, The Bounty, Revolution, The Mission. It all kinds of falls into that same kind of meaningful Oscar bait, where it feels more that someone's making the movie because they want to, as opposed to there's a story that they necessarily feel that they should be telling, or one that they need to be tying themselves into. So I'm not a huge fan of Last of the Mohicans. I watched it and it left me cold. And then the next one, which I also dislike, is another kind of time travel historical epic. Will Smith as Ali. Now this is a much better film than Last of the Mohicans, but it reminds me again of the kind of Oscar bait that you've got with films like American Gangster. Is that it's a historic. By the way, if you heard the cat is telling me off because I haven't let him in. Hang on a moment. I'm going to see if we can let the cat into the room. Right. So, talking about Ali, which is a historical epic with Will Smith as Muhammad Ali, it's very good actually, but it is a little bit dry, and I think it follows the kind of typical kind of rise and fall approach that a lot of boxing biopics do. So it kind of felt a little bit like watching Raging Bull without the alcoholism and the stupidity, and I think it has some really interesting ideas that are at foot inside the narrative, particularly around when Muhammad Ali was drafted to be a member of the military, and he came out with that famous phrase about no Viet Cong ever called him an N-word, and then where he stood up for his own beliefs, and he refused the draft of a country that was basically treating him like dirt and without respect. And that's something which I really felt a lot of affinity to. I don't have much loyalty to Britain as a national identity. When I was younger, and I was at university, I wasn't able to be supported by the state in any way, shape or form. The state decided to save itself some money by not paying me the measly unemployment benefit, which actually I needed because I was unemployed. And I felt very much that the state was only interested in me if I could join the army or I could pay tax. It certainly wasn't interested in looking after its citizens. And that's a kind of theory which I think Ali touches upon with that subplot. Good film, not amazing. Standard heroes rise and fall. Hang on a second. Dude, I'm going to show you. This is Price. He is not very interested in appearing on camera. He is about, how old are you now? He's about 9 months old. And he has been telling me off because he wanted to come into the room and he wanted some fuss. And now that I've picked him up and given him some fuss, he's run away, because that is how cats work. As soon as you actually want to give a cat any fuss, they generally don't want anything to do with you. Absolutely typical. So we've gone through 4 of the 11 features so far. The next one is Miami Vice from 2006. So this is Michael Mann revisiting the 1986 TV show. It's not actually probably a standard remake. It's more like it's a modern day cinematic version of a story which he's very interested in. And he does this elsewhere. If he sometimes he tries to tell a story and maybe he thinks the first time he went through it wasn't perhaps as successful as he wanted it to be, so he comes back to it later on in his career and recasts it, which is something that he did with LA Takedown. And Miami Vice is a pretty good movie. It's a bloke movie. There's drug deals, there's mobile phones, there's speedboats, there's all that type of stuff going on. There's grim people that turn up for one scene, and there's body parts that get thrown about, and there's double crosses and all that kind of stuff. But this is not that great for 2 reasons. I think the first one is it lacks, I think, some of the sheen that we've got of the original. And the second one is there are 2 editions of the film. There is the UK theatrical version, there is the American director's cut. And the unrated director's edition is a travesty, primarily because it has a different beginning. It has a lot more exposition at the beginning. And the director's cut also underscores one of the most pivotal scenes in the movie, with a cover version of Phil Collins' In the Air Tonight that completely mangles the iconic drum break from In the Air Tonight. And so therefore there is no point whatsoever of that occurring in the film. It's okay, it just feels a bit laboured, a bit grim, a bit meaningful, a bit of maybe mistaking, pensive shots into the distance, thinking about things whilst moody music plays over the soundtrack by Moby or Mogwai or Brian Eno, maybe. And it kind of mistakes that for gravitas, and it doesn't convince me at all. It's okay. It's an average, it's a more than average cult movie. It really is a more than average cult movie, but it is again, he's starting to repeat himself. Now, if you're a director, sometimes you're a one-trick pony, and sometimes that trick is fantastic, but repeating it, you end up going, I know the trick now, I know what to look for. And once you've seen the trick, you don't need to see it anymore. M. Night Shyamalan has made a career out of making movies like that, where everything gets revealed in the last scene, as per Unbreakable, Signs, The Sixth Sense, Lady in the Water, which is awful. I cannot understand how anybody can watch that movie. The Village, all those type of things. And you end up going, well, once I know the trick, what I'm really looking for is a director manipulating the narrative in order to tell a story. Much like when, if you watch James Cameron's Titanic, for example, the whole thing is geared towards making people cry at the end. And once you're aware of that, I felt very, very manipulated by him. I went, okay, I know what you're trying to do here. You're using certain keys, you're using certain notes and motifs and things like that, and then you become an exercise of watching something from a technical perspective as opposed to actually enjoying it as an act of storytelling. Miami Vice is an okay movie. It's an above average crime movie. There are far, far worse crime movies that have been made, and almost all of them are on Netflix. But from a director of Michael Mann's abilities, it is not, by any standards, his best movie. The next one we've got is Manhunter. Now, the first cinematic appearance of Hannibal Lecter, again available in the director's cut and the theatrical cut. And that's a really good film. It's pretty heavy going at certain points. It's the first film, or the first cinematic appearance by Hannibal Lecter. And Hannibal Lecter is played by a fantastic Irish actor called Brian Cox. I think Michael Mann, rang Brian Denny, actually, and said, could you play him? And he went, no, but I know somebody who'd be really good. Brian Cox. You will have seen Brian Cox. He plays a gloriously sleazy but straight-edged, above-board kind of guy that's very underboard as well. Manhunter's pretty good. It's not, in my opinion, as determined. It doesn't have as much distinctive flair as Red Dragon, which is the same story but features Anthony Hopkins. But it's a really good film. Also, by the way, it features an actor called William Peterson, who you may have seen in CSI, who also plays a detective in CSI. And then you kind of go, is there some kind of sub-story where this guy was the cop in Manhunter and then something went wrong and he became like one of the detectives in CSI? I don't know. Maybe I'm drawing too much into the whole cinematic universe of CSI and William Peterson. But there are stranger than theories on the net. So we're into the top 5 Michael Mann movies now. Number 5, Collateral. I really enjoy this film. It's almost a bottle episode of a movie. And by bottle episode, in TV shows, there's a thing called a bottle episode where they have a very, very small cast and a very small set of locations. Effectively, the show is housed inside a bottle, normally to save money, but sometimes to ratchet up tension. And some of the best bottle episodes, by the way, the best bottle episode I've ever seen is Breaking Bad, directed by Rian Johnson, and it's The Fly. What an incredible episode about them trying to track down and kill a fly inside their chemical lab. Fantastic, and directed by Rian Johnson, who's a great and underrated director. Collateral is a really good movie, but it is a strange movie. Tom Cruise definitely plays against type as a greying, somewhat bad-tempered contract killer, and Jamie Foxx in it plays a cab driver who's clearly a cab driver because he needs to make ends meet. And by the way, if there's job interviews, I think as an answer for a job interview question, they always ask, well, why do you want this job? And I think an acceptable answer should be, because I need money to eat. And Jamie Foxx is a struggling cab driver who wants to do more things with his life. And Tom Cruise is a contract killer. Naturally, their two paths intersect. It goes a little bit wrong for Tom Cruise, and then all of a sudden Jamie Foxx is a frog in fast boiling water as things get more and more tense. And it's also got, by the way, a fantastic cameo by Javier Bardem, who's only in it for like one scene, maybe 3 minutes. He plays a fantastic underworld boss who never raises his voice and never speaks above a mumble. And it's it's a really good movie. I really like it, but again, it is very much a man movie about man things. So we're into the last four, and this is, I think, where we hit really into the the peak levels, the first division of Michael Mann movies. Now there are four movies left, and one of them will be a surprise to you. You'll probably go, "Oh God, I'd forgotten that movie even existed." But the fourth movie is his major cinematic debut, the one that got him the biggest amount of, um, I think, acclaim. Is Thief, which was filmed in Chicago in 1981 and 1982. It's a dark, pretty straight edge, uncompromising crime thriller. One of the best crime thrillers that there is, and it has very low stakes actually. As far as crime movies go, it's not about stealing all the bullion from Fort Knox or anything like that. It's about one criminal committing one crime and making enough money to be able to retire from it, and also about the fact that he's come out of jail. He's trying to set his life in a different direction, and the difficulties that come alongside that. It's a moody snapshot of Chicago in 1982, and having been to Chicago, like me and many other people, it's really nice to see a world that I recognise on screen. It's also got a fantastic soundtrack by Tangerine Dream, who I've mentioned before. And if you get a chance to watch this and you want to watch an above average 80s crime movie, this is most definitely the one to go for. It's just, it feels a lot more real than some of the crime movies that there are. So that's the fourth one. Now we're into his top three, and his top three. What are his top three going to be? Well, most people would put this at number one. I wouldn't. Heat, the classic Men and Guns movie from 1995. Again, saw this at the cinema. That was a long 3 hours, and my girlfriend was very patient in me watching it at the time. It's around a robber and a bank robber and a police guy, a detective that's trying to track him down and stop him solving other crimes. Does that sound familiar to you? Have you seen Public Enemies before? Yes. So, and Heat is a remake of a 1989 American TV movie that Michael Mann made called LA Takedown, which is apparently much worse, but also much harder to get hold of on DVD. And I don't think it's available on any streaming sites that I have access to at the moment. Otherwise, I would have watched LA Takedown. Heat is a 3 hour epic kind of love letter to LA in 1995. It's got some wonderful moments in it. It is a masterpiece of crime movie making. It's also the first film where Robert De Niro and Al Pacino share the screen together, and they talk about the things that they would normally talk about, which is, your life and your career, and can I have some coffee, please? It's got some fantastic shootouts. It's got some very interesting kind of ideas around duty, obligation, the kind of things that Kubrick was touching upon in The Shining, where he has that whole scene about the validity of a contract and commitments and obligations and seeing them through. And it's a very good crime film. It's an epic of its type. It's about 3 hours long, and it's got I can recommend it very highly if you're into crime movies. It's got a director's cut, of course, because at this point in his career, pretty much every film of his has got a director's cut. It's got some fantastic music that comes into it. It's just a very good, clever crime movie. And think about the narrative construction of it. Every part of the narrative is a piece of an interlocking jigsaw. So there's no scenes that necessarily feel like they don't belong, no scenes that don't advance or progress the plot. There's weird and unusual interludes, which is exactly what happens in real life. So it's a really great movie. So we're into his last two. And if you know his movies, you know what the last two are. Here's a film that I have spoken about before that you have probably forgotten existed. The Keep. It's my favourite of his films, but it's not the best of his films. And it's my favourite of his films because it kind of touches the same kind of fantastic genre work that we also saw in Raiders of the Lost Ark and Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade. And it's a genre that doesn't get touched upon enough, which is Nazi, supernatural, horror, bad shit, juju, devil stuff. It's a fantastic movie. It hasn't been seen enough by anybody. It's been written out of history. Michael Mann didn't have the final cut on the theatrical version. So his final version of the movie, I think, was 3.5 hours long. And then at the last minute, I think it was down to 2 hours, and then the studio cut about another 25 minutes out of it and made it into garbage. The thing is, what remains is absolutely fantastic. It's got a top-notch cast. It's got Jürgen Prochnow in it. It's got Gabriel Byrne, got Ian McKellen, and it really kind of touches upon some themes which I think are absolutely fascinating. The themes being is that what is the nature of evil? What is the nature of the devil? Does evil and the devil feed upon human cruelty and injustice to each other? Is that then the evil feeding upon the existence of Nazis and SS and so on and so forth? But does the fact that the Nazis and the SS are human and flawed and make mistakes, does it then kind of, does it feed on them or does it feed off them, if that makes any sense? And it's just this weird and unusual atmosphere. Set in a completely unique area which has never been used for a film before or since. And it's a story around the battle between good and evil, the eternal battle between good and evil, but set inside, the frame of the battle between fascism and not fascism. And the devil's bargain, which is made to Ian McKellen's character, is very clearly, if you serve to me, the Nazis, and I will be able to kill them, you will be able to escape with your life. The Nazis that you hate will be destroyed. But also at the same point, the world will possibly be doomed. And it's a fantastic kind of film. The problem is it's 96 minutes long, and it really needs to be at least 2 hours long to be as good as it could be. It feels like the final finished theatrical version of this movie is actually you're watching a television edit where some of the scenes and content have been modified to suit TV. It feels like you're watching a kind of like a heavily bastardized TV version of the film, as opposed to the actual final theatrical cut. It's such a shame, because the final theatrical version of this movie just doesn't exist, can't be found, and Michael Mann has no interest in revisiting it, which is such an absolute shame, because I would love to see the final and full version of this movie that clearly at one point existed. And you can see fragments of it. You can see lots and lots of different and alternate scenes in the trailer, in some of the making of stuff that's been circulating, the first draft of the script that's out there. But it feels like it's a fantastic racehorse that's had its legs cut off at the knee. That's why this is number 2 and not number 1, even though this is one of my favourite films of all time. And also, by the way, and I will point out, it's pretty hard to get on DVD. That isn't a show off or a flex. If you want to order it, you can order it from Amazon. It's available. It was released in February 2020, only in Australia, only in a relatively low standard Laserdisc level transfer that features the Tangerine Dream soundtrack, and it's in stereo. There's no 5:1 mix in it, and it's in the 2.35 aspect ratio. So it's very much worth getting on DVD. But it's not the best version of the film that I think exists or could exist. So that leaves us to the number 1. And what could the number 1 movie be by Michael Mann? And since I haven't picked up this book for a little while, it's probably about time that I brought it up to you. So in a chronological fashion so far, we've touched upon a number of his movies. We've touched upon LA Takedown, The Jericho Mile, Public Enemies, Black Hat, Ali, Last of the Mohicans, Miami Vice, Manhunter. There's a fantastic poster for it. Collateral, Thief. What a fantastic poster that is, by the way. Thief, Heat, and number 2, The Keep. Number 1, The Insider. It's a kind of film about corporate power and espionage that is just not made enough of in this day and age. Absolutely not. There's another film by another director called Michael Clayton that touches upon and reaches on the same kind of areas. And The Insider is my favourite Michael Mann film for a number of reasons. The first one is I think it's the one where he, as a director, most clearly articulates the core theme that he's been working throughout all of his career, and that core theme is the battle between a person their conscience and their circumstances. That is a key battle that's come all the way through a huge number of his movies, and there is no more obvious example, and it's not handled so delicately or so deftly as it is in The Insider. And The Insider is about a guy called, oh God, Jeffrey Wigand. I had to remember his name by reading it on the back of the DVD box there. A carcinogenic scientist called Jeffrey Wigand, who realizes that his employer, the tobacco company, has been manipulating the results of scientific tests so that cigarettes can still be sold as part of the push by big tobacco to make money. And when he goes public with that and the known scientific impacts of cigarettes upon people, causes of cancer, ill health, so on and so forth, around how he is then monstered and demonized by a multi-million-pound, huge multinational set of corporations in order to utterly discredit the validity of anything that he's saying. And it really is, one man versus a massive corporation as a huge battle. And Jeffrey Wigand comes out of it, by the way, at no small loss to himself. He splits up with his wife, he loses his home, he loses his job, he's taken to court. He's thoroughly monstered and eviscerated for the crime of wanting people to know the facts that he's aware of. And it is, just an incredibly powerful film about what happens when you've got one person versus a corporation, and the size and scope of that battle. And the fact is, the corporation almost always wins, simply because in a war of attrition, the corporation has hundreds, if not thousands, of employees. It's got specialists at these type of things, and that one lone individual who's stuck in a war he didn't know existed, that he didn't know he's going to be fighting, that he's got none of the skills about to deal with, and he's got the very limited resources of whatever one person's individual kind of abilities to deal with it are. So it really is a David versus Goliath battle. Now, in my personal life, I've had a couple of circumstances where my beliefs and my morals have been contradicted by the actions of certain companies that I may or may not have been working with, and those companies chose to remove me from the company rather than have to deal with the consequences of what my beliefs and thoughts were at the time. I can't name those companies, and I'm not going to, but I've got personal experience of situations that were on a much, much smaller scale, but still equally damaging to me as an individual as they are in this movie. I came out of those circumstances, and I didn't have an employer in some circumstances. I didn't have a wife or a partner in one of the other circumstances because of the stress of going through that situation where the company decided that it wanted you to leave and you didn't necessarily want to leave, and around the ethics and morals that go with it. So there were things that I was watching in this movie when I was watching it recently, and I was like, I've lived that. I know that feeling. I know what it's like to come back to a house and to find out that your wife or your partner has gone. I know what it's like to feel that you're fighting a very lonely battle against a huge, faceless and unfeeling corporation. A company that's got hundreds of millions of pounds or dollars in its assets, and at its flex that it can use if it wants to do so in order to force you into a situation that you can't necessarily control. It's really tough to be in that situation, and I don't want to sound too melodramatic about it, but that period was some of the most difficult periods of my life. When I've been at a company, and the company had made the decision that I was no longer required, on the grounds of the fact that I had opinions that they didn't agree with about their activity. And then I kind of thought, well, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything, won't you? And sometimes I've been told I've got too much heart, and and that has made my life difficult on occasions. I know that, but I can't change who I am. It's important to believe in something. And with this film, what we see is a company that's decided to destroy a man because of what the company does. that the man does not like. Um, there was one occasion, I can't tell you when, there was one occasion where, and I don't think I was paranoid in thinking this, I had very strong reason to believe that a company was investigating me as an individual to look for evidence and reasons to influence and control my behaviour. And that's exactly where we are in this movie. So, you see a man in this movie who has a belief around scientific evidence, and you end up seeing that his whole life is like attached to a piece of cotton, and the company pulling it until everything unravels. And when I was watching this film, and I was like, oh God, I've been there, I have seen that. I have worked with and for companies that I feel have tried to destroy my life as punishment, and they haven't succeeded. They failed, and God damn it, they tried. They really tried. And at one point, it took me really close to me considering taking my own life, which clearly I haven't done. And my circumstances are much, much better now, and I'm much more mature in being able to deal with these problems. I have a better set of armoury around it. But you imagine if you're one lone person and you're, at a certain age, and a whole company has or somebody in the company that's pretty sincere, and also now someone who's pretty senior has put their belief into and has instructed the company, and the company will support them to do so, to unravel a person's life. It's a really, really difficult situation to be in. I very, very strongly recommend this movie. It is Michael Mann's best movie. It is a movie that I think is the most obvious and the best way in which he's tackled the core theme which he's touched upon throughout all of his movies, which is the battle between what a person believes and the world a person lives in, and which call do you make. This is absolutely incredible movie, and it does have, 7 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture. Al Pacino's in it, and there's a whole subplot around Al Pacino as an investigative journalist who's facing against the strings of his employer, who's trying to decide whether the story is newsworthy or not. There's a man that's put his life on the line in order to have the truth come out. It's a really, really powerful movie. I think it's his best movie, and that's why it's my number one of the Michael Mann movies. Now, there's your countdown. I have no idea if this was interesting or not. I will be talking about other directors when I've finished watching their bodies of work. I've finished David Fincher. I'm working on Steven Spielberg. I'm working on Stanley Kubrick. I'm working on David Lynch. I'll probably watch all the Bond movies actually at some point, and I'll be horrified by some of the attitudes that are on show. I think in some of the 60s ones, especially that statement about how you can't listen to the Beatles without earmuffs. And as usual, I'm going to wrap up here. If you've got any suggestions about what you'd be interested in hearing me talk about in future episodes, please put them in the comments section. There is, of course, and there will always be, one person who downvotes this as soon as it goes live. I do see you, and I don't have much complimentary to say, really. It's a bit sad, to be honest, isn't it? And in the meantime, take care of yourselves and each other. As Jerry Springer always used to say, I will see you again soon, hopefully in person at some point as well. If you're going to the bar, mine will be a cider. Anyway, I will talk to you all again some other time. Thank you for your time and interest and patience while I've spent 45 minutes talking about the films of Michael Mann and the ranking that I would have for them. There are probably quicker ways to get a ranking than this. There's probably an article on Screen Rant or somewhere that will take about 3 minutes to read. But thank you anyway. I'll see you all again soon. All right, bye.